Previously on Dawn of Sapiens. Where did Neanderthals come from? Where did they move to? What insights does the Neanderthal genome reveal? Up to this point in the series, we have concentrated on the emergence, movement, and DNA of Neanderthals. In this video, I want to explore their basic biology. Welcome to Dawn of Sapiens. Over the years, the perception of Neanderthals has oscillated between brutish imbeciles to beings nearly indistinguishable from us modern humans. In the previous video, I demonstrated both similarities and unique characteristics of their DNA. But what details do their fossil remains reveal? On average, Neanderthals were shorter than modern and ancient humans. Males were about 164 centimeters or 5 feet 5 inches tall, while females were 155 centimeters or 5 feet tall. Males likely weighed around 80 kilograms or 176 pounds, and females weighed 66 kilograms or 145 pounds. Of course, there are always exceptions. In modern-day northern Israel, Amud I lived 60,000 years ago. This guy had several interesting features, but his height alone makes him unique. At 179 centimeters, or 5 feet 10 inches tall, he may have been the tallest Neanderthal to ever live. We'll never really know, but he is certainly the tallest Neanderthal ever discovered. The size difference between the sexes, or the sexual dimorphism, is relatively small. For instance, males are about 5.5% taller and 17.6% more massive. But if you compare this to gorillas, whose males are a whopping 42.6% heavier, this difference doesn't seem quite so big. In fact, the sexual dimorphism observed in Neanderthals is nearly identical to that of modern humans, whose males are about 15% more massive than females. The degree of sexual dimorphism can be used as a clue to mating systems and social behaviors. But we'll discuss that in a later video. Much of this mass comes from the musculature of Neanderthals. When researchers study the fossil remains, they notice that the soft tissue attachment points on the bone were likely anchoring larger muscles than found in both ancient and modern humans. I don't think I'm reaching when I say that in this day and age, it's a well-known fact that Neanderthals were sturdier and more powerful than those of us living today. But what does the science actually show? Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the first rabbit hole of the day. The two varieties of muscle, fast twitch and slow twitch, are thought to have evolved over 500 million years ago, after the emergence of the backbone. Fast twitch muscles contract in quick, powerful bursts, but fatigue quickly. Slow twitch muscles contract more slowly and are able to sustain workloads for much longer periods. Since the frozen Neanderthal is yet to be found, scientists are unable to directly measure the distribution of fast twitch muscles of Neanderthals. Looking at the general pattern of fast and slow twitch fibers can provide some clues as to where they likely sat on the mammalian spectrum. Of all mammals measured in this study, sapiens possess the lowest level of fast twitch muscles, 35% in their hind limbs. The next closest mammal happens to be the slow loris, who has proportionally 9% more fast twitch muscles than sapiens. In this study, humans are the only species with a percentage in the 30s. Of the mammals measured, including the chimpanzee, 11 out of 14 had 60% or more fast twitch muscle in their hind limbs. When considering mammals as a whole, there's no real reason to suspect that Neanderthals differ extensively with sapiens. They are infinitely more similar to us than to any other mammal on this table. Whether you consider body plan, in other words bipedal posture, environment, ecological niche, diet, body type, mass, or trophic level, Neanderthals and sapiens might as well be twins. Despite Neanderthals' presumed sprinter status, personally I would be surprised if the fast twitch content in their lower legs was even 20% higher than in the legs of modern humans. Like I said, they are infinitely more similar to us than a slow loris, cheetah, or chimpanzee for that matter. I think we can all at least agree that their ratio of fast twitch muscle was likely somewhere between ours and that found in chimpanzees. Some of you are probably questioning me at this point, since Neanderthals have often been accused of being powerful sprinters and having superior muscles than us dainty sapiens. To this I say, what if it's not Neanderthals that evolved a powerful sprinting physique, but it was our sapiens lineage that lost the power? Sometime before 310 million years ago, a gene known as ACTN duplicated in a common ancestor of birds and mammals. This resulted in two genes on the same genome, ACTN2 and ACTN3. ACTN2 is essentially the ancestral gene and found in both slow twitch and fast twitch muscles, while ACTN3 is a duplicate of the gene that is only found in fast twitch muscles. This means the fast and slow twitch muscle divergence likely occurred over 500 million years ago. It wasn't until either 1 million or sometimes between 90 and 60,000 years ago, depending on who you ask, that a neutral allele 577X emerged in Homo sapiens that functionally altered fast twitch muscle. This allele is known as a null mutation and essentially disabled the ACTN3 gene. This is because this null mutation results in a premature stop codon occurring when a cytosine base mutates into a thymine base at position 66,560,624 on chromosome 11 in the ACTN3 gene. Individuals who inherited a copy of this allele from each parent completely lack the ACTN3 proteins, while those with one copy produce about half the normal amount. Amorum et al. Argue that this allele didn't become positively selected for until about 60,000 years ago in the major out of Africa wave. In fact, they found that the further from Africa, the more common this allele becomes. When the ACTN3 gene is shut off, the resulting fast twitch muscle has lower strength, reduced volume, becomes more damaged from quote exercise, and even causes lower bone mineral density. On the other hand, the 577X allele produces fast twitch muscles that are less calorically demanding and able to endure a workload for much longer than their explosive, powerful counterparts. In a 2024 study of Spain's top division of football, La Liga, researchers discovered physical and behavioral differences observed in players homozygous for the 577X null mutation. During the 2021-2022 season, those with no ACTN3 proteins expressed in their fast twitch muscles ran 4.2% less distance overall. Specifically, they covered 13.1% less distance at speeds of 21 kilometers per hour or 13 miles per hour or faster. Individuals homozygous with the ACTN3 deficient allele were also 2.3 times more likely to get injured than those with zero copies of the 577X allele. We've seen what this allele does in modern humans, but the big question is, what does this mean for Neanderthals? To answer this, we need to first determine what this gene and its alleles looked like in Neanderthals. Earlier, I said the 577X mutation emerged in the out of Africa sapiens population. This naturally implies that Neanderthals lacked this mutation, which means their fast twitch muscles were of the power variety and they were also protected from injuries. According to a study led by John Stewart of Bournemouth University, this was true until at least 44,000 years ago. In this study, they identified Denisova 5, Mesmaskaya 1, and Vendiha 33.19 with only the ancestral allele, while Mesmaskaya 2, Z4-1514, and Q56-1 had one copy of the endurance-inducing 577X allele. Everyone in the second group lived after 44,000 years ago. For the majority of Neanderthal history, it appears they had the power or sprinter's allele. Interestingly, somewhere along the line, terminal Neanderthals gained the highly efficient endurance allele. In fact, the youngest Neanderthal in my dataset, SPY 94A, was homozygous for 577X. In this regard, Spy 94A had the potential to be the most accomplished Neanderthal endurance runner of all time. Beyond running ability, the fact that the majority of Neanderthals had robust, powerful, fast-twitch muscles shouldn't be a surprise when their skeletons are considered. This is Gibraltar 1. This lady is the only Neanderthal Charles Darwin ever laid eyes on. The only impression Darwin left on file was in a letter to a friend when he wrote, quote, "Falconer brought me the wonderful Gibraltar skull." Though that's all we know of the encounter, I can't help but wonder what Darwin was thinking when his eyes roamed from feature to feature across the skull. Did he focus on the similarities or the differences between it and modern humans? Compared to modern humans, Neanderthal craniums are elongated and low. The back of their head also develops a knot or an occipital bun. Neanderthals possess swellings above the eyes and nose that project out from the surface in one continuous bar of bone. This bar of bone is hollow, and unlike in Homo sapiens, whose swellings are weak, only exist above the eyes and arch around the orbitals of the eyes, Neanderthal brow ridges are one large continuous projection from eye to eye. Cranial capacities between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are comparable. Even with similar brain sizes, a difference in cranium shape resulted in a difference in brain shape, which may have led to a difference of cognition. One of the largest Neanderthal craniums ever discovered, at about 1,740 cubic centimeters, happens to belong to our buddy Ahmoud 1. This isn't surprising since we know body size and brain size scale with each other. A 5'10" Neanderthal would naturally have a larger brain. The eye sockets of Neanderthals are bigger than both ancient and modern sapiens. I'm not sure if the eyes are the window to the soul, but researchers Yulund Pierce, Chris Stringer, and Robin Dunbar argue at the very least eye sockets are the window to the brain. They specifically argue that components of the visual system scale with each other. Socket size, eye size, and visual regions of the brain all increase or decrease in step. The researchers point out from 200,000 to 76,000 years ago, sapiens on average had larger endocranial volumes, about 1,535 cubic centimeters, and Neanderthals had volumes of 1,272 cubic centimeters. But between 76,000 and 27,000 years ago, these species had on average matching cranial volumes at 1,473 cubic centimeters. The surprising conclusion of this study is that in Neanderthals, it was primarily the visual cortex that grew. Except for about 36 cubic centimeters, the rest of the brain regions remained static in size. If we consider the famous Dunbar's number, which originated from one of the authors of this study, the smaller non-visual brain of Neanderthals could help to explain their tendency of living in smaller groups. In social species, larger brains usually correlate with larger group sizes. This indication of a 60% larger visual cortex and eye sockets or orbits mean later Neanderthals probably had larger eyes than Homo sapiens at any point in time. With a much larger visual cortex, I can't help but wonder how differently they would perceive the world than modern humans looking at the same landscape under the same lighting. The area below the eye sockets from cheek to cheek and between the upper tooth line to the top of the nasal opening projects out in Neanderthals. This midfacial projection is easiest seen when looking from above. Modern humans have a much flatter face in this regard. But because more basal species such as Homo ergaster and Homo erectus both have protruding midfacial regions, it's likely that this is the ancestral state. And in this aspect, it is sapiens that are the weird ones rather than Neanderthals. Below the midface, Neanderthals lacked chins. So did Homo erectus, antecessor, and heidelbergensis. I think it's safe to say that no chin was the ancestral condition. Yet once again, there is an exception to the rule. In 1880, a mandible was found at a cave site in the Czech Republic. This mandible had features in line with the Neanderthal designation, except for the fact that it had what scientists described as a, quote, weak chin. It also happens to be the first Neanderthal remains directly associated with fire, as it was found near a hearth. The presence of a chin confounded scientists. As late as 1969, some researchers were still arguing that this individual was a transitional form between Neanderthals and modern humans. However, since that discovery, at least four other Neanderthal individuals have been found bearing a chin. Most are classic or terminal Neanderthals, with the exception of a Neanderthal that lived on the Italian peninsula sometime between 130,000 and 70,000 years ago. Did these classic and terminal Neanderthals gain a chin from interbreeding with our species? The early Italian individual seems to throw a wrench in that narrative. Every once in a while, a Neanderthal is just randomly born with a chin. I mean, there's people alive today with a receding or no chin at all. Neanderthals also had large projecting noses compared to modern humans, and their frontal sinuses are also larger. The popular reason for this was conceived during a time when Neanderthals were still thought of as Ice Age savants who were one with the ice. The thinking goes that larger noses allowed more harsh cold air to be preheated before it reached the lungs. These days, Neanderthals aren't seen as quite the Ice Age champions we thought they were. One alternative theory for their larger noses and frontal sinus is they allow for more air per breath to be inhaled, which in turn might allow for a higher resting metabolic rate. This seems logical, as we've already discussed they have more muscle to fuel than us dainty humans. In part 2, I discussed a mutation that probably caused hearing loss and deafness in classic and terminal Neanderthals. I'll get back to hearing later, but for now, I want to explore the aspects of the semicircular canals independent of hearing. The semicircular canal system senses self-rotation when an animal moves through an environment. This input is then used to help coordinate posture and body movement in three-dimensional space, especially during locomotion. The radius of the curvature of semicircular canals is positively correlated with agility of locomotion in primates and other mammals. Animals with faster or more agile locomotion have large canals relative to their body size. For example, sloths have very small canals for their body size, while highly maneuverable birds have larger canals even when compared to less maneuverable birds. Because species inhabit unique niches, their locomotive patterns are also unique. This means the morphology of a species' semicircular canals can act somewhat like a fingerprint. In mammals, this seems to be true since the bony labyrinth tends to show a species-specific morphology. The Neanderthal anterior and posterior semicircular canals are smaller than those found in modern humans. Interestingly, Homo sapiens and Homo erectus have nearly identical semicircular canal morphology. If you ask me, this is likely a signal of the different environments they inhabited. Sapiens and erectus lived in flat woodland mosaic and savanna, while Neanderthals often lived in mountainous, uneven terrain. If environment constrains behavior, it's likely sapiens and erectus more often jogged considerable distances than Neanderthals. Evolutionary anthropologist Fred Spoor puts it this way, quote, "On the whole, Neanderthals were endurance walkers rather than runners," end quote. These days, researchers are finding that using the differences in canal morphology, they can even distinguish between populations within a species. A 2024 study analyzed the semicircular canals of Ettingsdorf H3 and Rehlingen when they incorporated their findings with the already available data from two proto-Neanderthals, AT6672 and Steinheim, which is an early Neanderthal population, the Krapina group, and various classic and terminal Neanderthals, interesting clusters of similarity emerged. The most ancient cluster is Cluster 1. This group includes AT-6672 and Steinheim, which lived 435 and 350,000 years ago, respectively. The second cluster is by far the most interesting. That's because the 130,000-year-old Croatian Krapina population has the most unique inner ear bones, and their semicircular canals do not cluster with any of the other ear bones. According to the authors, their ear bones are primitive and much of their uniqueness likely evolved locally. In other words, the Crapina population is probably a long isolated branch, similar to the recently famous Thorin individual, whose DNA indicates a population that was isolated for at least 50,000 years. The third cluster includes the Proto Neanderthal Rehlingen, who lived 320,000 years ago, and the early Neanderthal Eringsdorf H3, who lived 230,000 years ago. This cluster is interesting because, on top of containing what I consider a Proto Neanderthal and an early, you might even say way early Neanderthal, this cluster also contains the classic and terminal Neanderthals. This means Rehlingen and Eringsdorf H3 were part of the ancestral lineage of all classic and terminal Neanderthals. This video is supposed to be discussing Neanderthal physiology and morphology, but because of the fingerprinting properties of the inner ear bones, I couldn't help but take this opportunity to revisit Neanderthal lineage from a non-DNA angle. Neanderthals appear to have longer than expected clavicles, or collarbones. This is true when compared to living humans, but ancient sapiens also had longer clavicles than us modern humans. If a Neanderthal and an ancient human were to stand side by side, the Neanderthal collarbone would still probably seem wider, but that's because other parts of their anatomy are proportionally shorter than in modern humans. I'll touch on that later. When it comes to clavicle length, an interesting fact is the clavicles of all hominins are longer, even as a fetus, than in chimpanzees. These longer clavicles are directly responsible for difficult births, resulting in fetal and maternal injury and possibly death. Yet anthropologists Natalie Ladesina and Matt Cartmill concluded this increased risk of death did not outweigh selective pressures, which are yet to be fully identified. And because male clavicles are 10% bigger, this selective pressure might have been driven by the benefit of males having longer collarbones. The driver of selection in clavicles are yet to be known. The shoulder blades themselves were proportionally larger and wider than in sapiens. The shoulder joints are large, likely as a result of the Neanderthal's heavily muscled body and the forces the joint must endure. Neanderthals are famous for being broad-chested. They are said to have a bell-shaped torso. Their rib cages are larger than in Homo sapiens, with the exception of cold-adapted groups, which in the study I'm referencing is represented by the Inuit of North America, the Fuegian of South America, and the Norsemen of Northern Europe. The two Neanderthal individuals analyzed in this study, Shanidar 3 and Kimbara 2, have a pyramidal or bell-shaped rib cage, which results in a deeper chest or thorax. The individual ribs themselves are larger and more robust than in Homo sapiens. Plainly speaking, the Neanderthal rib cage is larger than all modern humans, with the exception of cold-adapted modern populations. However, the ribs themselves are more robust. Put another way, Neanderthals are bigger boned than modern humans. There have been several arguments seeking to explain the peculiar shape of Neanderthal torsos, the most obvious being a larger torso allows for more heat retention in cold environments. Another argument that's popular among the carnivore crowd is the shape evolved to allow support for an enlarged liver, which is required for an extreme protein-heavy diet. A third suggestion, which we have briefly discussed, is the shape evolved to support larger lungs, which in turn provides more oxygen to support a high metabolism. Lopez Ray and his co-authors throw their support in for this last argument when they stated, quote, "The Neanderthal respiratory would allow greater oxygen supply, leading to higher activity rates that would tentatively be suitable to ambush hunting strategies where explosive strength is required." The cold-adapted hypothesis was previously widely assumed based on many features of the Neanderthal, but in the last 10 to 15 years, researchers realized new findings didn't support this assumption. It's still popular today in pop science, but in this case it doesn't seem likely. That's because Shanidar 3 and Kabara 2 are actually tropical Neanderthals. Shanidar 3 called what is modern day northern Iraq home, and Kabara 2 lived in northern Israel. The enlarged liver argument is possible, but Lopez Rey et al. Argue against this line of reasoning on the basis of diet. They point to the diverse diet, which included plants, ascertained from their dental calculus, to argue that both of these Neanderthals weren't especially meat-heavy individuals. The authors also note that while this bell shape might seem primitive, it actually isn't seen in basal hominins. This hints that this shape is unique to Neanderthals, regardless if its emergence is driven by diet, climate, oxygen consumption, or even genetic drift. Researchers have found that both major curves in the Neanderthal back were straighter. However, the amount of curvature still falls within natural variation seen in modern humans. The pelvis of Neanderthals is broader and more robust than ours. The reasons for this are unknown. The carnivore fellows argue that this was another adaptation to enlarged liver and kidneys to help process large amounts of protein. Evolutionary anthropologists Tim Weaver and John Jacques Hublin point out that there's some correlation between pelvic width and climate. By 100,000 years ago, African Homo sapiens were tropical adapted and had a relatively narrow pelvis. They demonstrate that the wide pelvis is the basal condition, and because Neanderthals lived in milder climate, a narrower pelvis was never selected for. Pomeroy et al. Point out that beginning at least as early as Proto-Neanderthals in Cima de los Huesos to the terminal Neanderthals, the Neanderthal pelvis was gradually becoming narrower. It's hard to say why. Climatically, temperatures were up and down. If you believe that this feature is a function of diet, that would indicate that the Neanderthal lineage gradually ate less and less meat. I'm not sure the carnivore bros will be happy with the thought of that. Earlier, I mentioned that the collarbone of Neanderthals would probably appear longer to us than it actually is. This optical illusion is partly due to the fact that both the arms and legs of Neanderthals are shorter than ours, relative to torso length. What's interesting is the fact that this reduction in length isn't proportional. Their arms and legs wouldn't appear to us as miniature versions of our own. Not only are they shorter overall, but the distal segments of their arms and legs are shorter than found in Homo sapiens. In other words, the segments between their elbow and wrist and their knee and their ankle are between 3 and 7% shorter than in modern and ancient sapiens. According to Higgins and Ruff, shorter lower legs would result in inefficient locomotion on flat terrains, but on steep terrains they become advantageous. They argue that traveling down steep terrains is where shorter lower legs shine. In other words, shorter lower legs help you to keep the brakes while traveling down steep terrain. Personally, I know when my unit was forced to run down the steep cliff roads to Taragi Beach in Guam, different muscles and ligaments became fatigued than when running on flat or even uphill surfaces. Traveling down to the ankle, the Neanderthal heel appears to be longer than in sapiens. This has the effect of requiring less length of the Achilles. Less Achilles means less energy absorption during running, which means less efficient running. Generally speaking, the foot of Neanderthals are mostly indistinguishable from Homo sapiens feet. The one exception is the talus. This bone directly bears the weight transmitted from the tibia and fibula. The shape of the Neanderthal talus shows sign of a pronated walking pattern. This happens when the ankle and foot rolls inwards while walking. In modern humans, this pattern is often seen in obese individuals. Considering that Neanderthals were more massive than humans, foot pronation probably shouldn't be a surprise. Another modern human group that experiences pronation at high rates are athletes. It's a double whammy for Neanderthals. Any hunter-gatherer group are extremely active and should certainly be considered athletes. But because Neanderthals likely utilize explosive power, they are definitely athletes in my book. Pronated walking and running results in ligaments with less tension and essentially loose joints. This might not be the disadvantage that one might presume. For instance, Flexible ankle joints might be beneficial when operating in uneven mountainous terrains. On the other hand, I wouldn't be surprised if Neanderthals rolled their ankles more than they'd like. One thing I'd like to point out is the majority of these traits fall within the range of modern human variation. The distribution might be shifted one way or another, but many of these traits aren't any more extreme than what we see in modern humans today. There are exceptions, of course, like the brow ridge or the shorter distal arms and legs, but for the most part, I would argue that what makes them different from modern humans is the unique combination of these traits that are mostly found in modern humans, but don't manifest in the combination seen in Neanderthals. There's people today alive with no chin, and I'm sure there's people alive today with shorter distal arms and legs. There's many people with large broad noses and some mid-facial projection, but you're not likely to get somebody today with all these features combined. That's not to say that there aren't differences in Neanderthals, because there certainly are, from their skull size and brain shape, brow ridges, and tooth morphology, which I didn't talk about here. I just think it's worth pointing out the nuances that I'm talking about. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for the next installment on Neanderthal biology.